Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go into a brand new chapter, which is Chapter 5, Cellular Respiration and Fermentation. Once again, I'm Miss Delia, and if you're ready, let's have a look at what awaits us in this chapter. So, what can we expect? In Chapter 5, we will be learning about aerobic respiration and also anaerobic respiration. I'm sure these are familiar terms to you, so we'll just move right on. Under aerobic respiration, we'll be learning about several processes, starting with glycolysis, then followed by link reaction, and then the citric acid or the Krebs cycle, and last but not least, we'll learn about oxidative phosphorylation. Under anaerobic respiration, we'll be learning about glycolysis and also lactate fermentation and alcohol fermentation. So it's going to be divided into 4 videos. In this first video, we'll be looking at the first subtopic, which is 5.1 aerobic respiration. Now, here are the learning outcomes for this video lesson. I hope that by the end of this video, you will be able to state the needs for energy and the role of respiration in living organisms, and also outline the complete oxidation of glucose, which will involve glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. So if you're ready, let's continue. Okay, first things first, let's talk about what is cellular respiration. Di bukan sekadar cakap sel itu bernafas sahaja, but the proper definition for how a cell respires is cellular respiration is the catabolic pathway of aerobic and anaerobic respiration, which break down organic molecules and use an electron transport chain to produce ATP. So definisi untuk cellular respiration adalah catabolic pathway means dia adalah siri proses ataupun siri step yang akan memecahkan sesuatu molekul. Okay, so it's going to break something down. It involves both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Yang penting ada organic molecule. Organic molecule, for example, glucose or other carbohydrates or fats and proteins. Those things are going to get broken down to produce ATP. ATP, just a reminder, is adenosine triphosphate, which is a nucleotide with unstable phosphate bonds that release energy when the bonds break. This is a form of chemical energy that energizes the cell. Okay, so that's just the very quick definition, and we're moving on and talking about the importance of energy. Kenapa kita cakap pasal tenaga? Because cells need energy. Living cells require transfusions of energy from outside sources to perform their many tasks. Example of tasks that the cell needs to do is synthesis of macromolecules or polymers or metabolism or catabolic pathways. So, cell itu perlukan tenaga untuk buat penghasilan macromolecule. Okay, so example is photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, the cell needs energy in order to produce a macromolecule known as glucose, which is also a type of carbohydrate. Cells need energy for transport. They need energy to pump substances across their membranes during active transport. The third is that cells would need energy for movement. So the cells need to contract muscles if it's a muscle cell, or they need to move their flagella if it's a cell that has flagella. All of those would need energy in the form of ATP. And last but not least, living cells need energy for reproduction. So for growth and reproduction of a cell, especially we're referring to cell division, it's going to need a lot of energy. Practically everything in our body will require energy. So what does energy have to do with cellular respiration? The role of cellular respiration is to produce energy that is required by living things. And this energy is produced in the form of ATP, which will be used in performing work in the cells and also as an instant source of energy for living organisms. Through cellular respiration, heat energy is also produced, but when we are talking about cellular respiration, usually we focus more on the energy in the form of ATP. So kita lebih tekankan yang bahagian tenaga dihasilkan dalam ATP daripada fokus dalam heat energy. Okay, so this next slide is just talking about where the energy in our ecosystem comes from. So energy enters our ecosystem as sunlight and it will leave as heat. Photosynthesis takes sunlight, generates CO2 and organic molecules. Those organic molecules will be used during cellular respiration. And the energy that we release from those organic molecules started from up here, stored here, released here, and then used by cells here. Okay, so that is what this slide is telling you about. And then I'm going to explain a little bit more about ATP. As I've said before, ATP is a nucleotide with an unstable phosphate bond. It consists of a ribose sugar, a nitrogenous base called adenine, and also 3 phosphate groups arranged as such. Why does ATP get used so much? Well, it's because cells get energy by breaking the bond in ATP. Bila kita ambil ATP, dan kita kasih pecah bond dia di sini, between the last and the second phosphate, we are going to release energy from that ATP. When we do that, ATP will be reduced to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. Okay, so if you are getting confused with the naming, this is just a diagram or image to show you that if it's this whole thing, we call it ATP. Kalau 2 phosphate, kita panggil dia ADP. Kalau 1 phosphate, kita panggil dia AMP. Dan kalau begini saja adenosine, kalau begini saja adenine, kalau begini saja ribose. Ini adalah phosphate group. Okay, so that is what this slide is talking about. Let's continue talking more about that ATP. So, like I've said earlier, when energy is needed, ATP will be hydrolyzed. So, kita akan pecahkan ATP bila kita perlukan tenaga. Hydrolysis of that unstable bond between the phosphates will release energy. Kita pecahkan, energy keluar. And that energy will be transferred to a cell that requires energy. ATP can be resynthesized. Kaya kita boleh buat semula ATP from an ADP using energy released from cellular respiration. So, kita boleh hasilkan ATP daripada ADP menggunakan tenaga yang dikeluarkan daripada cellular respiration. And we're going to make that ATP by reattaching a phosphate group through phosphorylation process. So, cara kita buat ATP melalui ADP adalah kita ambil ADP, tambah 1 phosphate group, ambil tenaga, masukkan ke dalam benda tu, dia akan jadi ATP and a byproduct of water. Okay, just a very quick run through, and that is how we use and remake ATP. Now, talking about cellular respiration, we can divide cellular respiration into 2 types. The first type is aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen, and the second type is anaerobic respiration, which does not require oxygen. And that can be quickly summarized with this chart right here. Okay, kalau kita mau buat cellular respiration, kita akan start dengan glycolysis. Selepas glycolysis, hasilnya iaitu pyruvate, ATP, NADH, dan H, boleh pergi kepada mana-mana proses di bawah. So that pyruvate could be used in a link reaction. After link reaction, it will be used in Krebs cycle. From that Krebs cycle, it will continue to another process called electron transport chain. And this one on the left side is the pathway for aerobic respiration. So daripada glycolysis, link reaction, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, sebelah kiri ini adalah aerobic respiration. Kalau dia ikut jalan di sebelah kanan, which is glycolysis terus lactic acid fermentation, ataupun daripada glycolysis kepada alcohol fermentation, ini adalah respiration yang tidak menggunakan oxygen. So yang sebelah kanan, this and this are anaerobic respiration. Let's also talk about where each of these processes take place. Now look at these boxes that I have on the flowchart. If it's in the blue box, that means this process occurs in the cytosol, which is cytoplasm of the cell. Okay? And then if it's in this orange box, that means it occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. If it is in this purple box, that means this process occurs in the inner membrane or crista of the mitochondria. Okay, and over here, all anaerobic respiration will occur in the cytosol only. So, ini akan masuk mitochondria, ini akan steady cytosol ataupun cytoplasm. Talking about aerobic respiration, this is the definition. Aerobic respiration is a catabolic pathway by which glucose is completely oxidized into carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP in the presence of oxygen. So, kalau kamu diminta untuk explain apa to aerobic respiration, inilah definisi dia. Mula dengan glucose, oxidized, completely oxidized, so you need oxygen, into carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the presence of oxygen. So it's going to involve oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide and reduction of oxygen to water. Okay, so that is aerobic respiration, whereas for anaerobic respiration, it is the incomplete oxidation of organic compounds, and it does not involve oxygen. Anaerobic respiration boleh dibahagi kepada dua jenis. Jenis yang pertama adalah alcohol fermentation, and this will occur in plants. You would start with your glucose, and in the end, you will produce ethanol, carbon dioxide, and ATP. The second type of anaerobic respiration is lactate fermentation. Lactate fermentation, you would start with glucose, but you would produce this very long molecule, which is lactic acid and ATP. Okay, we're going back to aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration occurs in the cytoplasm and the mitochondria of eukaryotic cells, except in red blood cells. That is just an extra tidbit. Red blood cells do not have mitochondria and they don't do any aerobic respiration because they're the ones carrying oxygen, so they can't use up the stock. Okay, so all other cells in a eukaryotic organism would do aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration will be divided into 3 stages, and we'll look at each of these stages in the coming videos. So video akan datang, kita akan tengok setiap stage. Stage 1, glycolysis. Stage 2, link reaction. And also Krebs cycle. And stage 3 would be oxidative phosphorylation. It can also be easily summarized in this diagram. So, ada beberapa version untuk diagram ini, tapi yang penting kamu boleh nampak dia mula dengan glycolysis, ada pyruvate oxidation ataupun digelar sebagai link reaction, diikuti dengan citric acid cycle ataupun Krebs cycle, dan last berakhir dengan oxidative phosphorylation. So, bila-bila masa kamu nampak diagram ini, kamu juga boleh nampak dia ada tulis ATP dihasilkan melalui apa cara dan berapa molekul ATP terhasil untuk stage tersebut. Okay, before we talk more about respiration, let's go through a few terms. Okay, ada beberapa term yang kamu harus faham. The first term is oxidation. Oxidation is the loss of electrons from a substance involved in a redox reaction. So example of oxidation that you will see in cellular respiration is when succinate is oxidized to form fumarate when 2 of its hydrogens are transferred to FAD forming FADH2. So ini adalah contoh dalam cellular respiration di mana kamu akan jumpa oxidation. The next term is reduction. If oxygen is when you lose electrons, reduction is when you gain 1 or more electrons or hydrogen atoms by an atom, ion, or molecule. So example of reduction that you will see in this chapter is when reducing NAD plus to accept 2 hydrogen to form NADH plus H plus. Okay, ini adalah contoh dalam chapter ini di mana kamu akan jumpa reduction. Cellular respiration, especially aerobic respiration, is a series of oxidation and reduction. Oxidation is addition of oxygen or removal of hydrogen or loss of electrons. whereas reduction is the removal of oxygen, addition of hydrogen, or gain of electrons. So bahagian ini sampai sini, ini adalah oxidation. Sini sampai sini adalah reduction. I hope that's helpful. Let's continue with the third term. The third term that you should know is decarboxylation. Decarboxylation means it is a reaction in which a molecule of carbon dioxide is removed from a carboxyl group of an organic acid. So kalau kita ada satu organic acid, kita keluarkan satu molekul CO2, then that is decarboxylation. Pembuangan carboxyl. For example, we have pyruvate, which is converted to acetyl-CoA. This process is called decarboxylation. Another term that you need to know is phosphorylation and dephosphorylation. Phosphorylation is the addition of a phosphate group to ADP or another substance. So kita tambah phosphate adalah phosphorylation. Example is when ADP gain or accept phosphate to form ATP. Kalau bukan ADP, kalau benda lain yang dapat phosphate group pun digelar sebagai phosphorylation juga. Dephosphorylation, terbaliklah, ini adalah kehilangan phosphate group. So kalau ATP kehilangan satu phosphate group ataupun substrate lain kehilangan phosphate group, itu adalah dephosphorylation. I'm telling you about oxidation, reduction, phosphorylation, and dephosphorylation because we want to talk about oxidative phosphorylation, substrate-level phosphorylation, and also in the next chapter, photophosphorylation. So, 3 benda yang kamu nampak di screen ini adalah 3 cara untuk menghasilkan ATP dalam sel. So these are the 3 types of ATP production that you can find in the cell. Oxidative phosphorylation and substrate-level phosphorylation is what you will see in cellular respiration. This purple one down here is for chapter 6 when we learn about photosynthesis. Baiklah, sekarang kita cuba untuk memahami benda merah dan benda hijau ini. So we start with the red box first, oxidative phosphorylation. It is the formation of ATP by using energy derived from the redox reactions of electron transport chain. So ini adalah penghasilan tenaga melalui ETC. That's oxidative phosphorylation. Most of the ATP produced through aerobic respiration are produced through this way. In glycolysis and Krebs cycle, some electrons from the substrates are transferred to NAD+ and FAD to form NADH and also FADH2. NADH and FADH2 will then pass these electrons to the ETC. So, bila sampai kepada ETC, inilah diagram yang kamu akan tengok dan belajar. This is a diagram showing the electron transport chain in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And we learn about this more in 5.1.3. The one in the green box, the second type of ATP formation is this thing, substrate-level phosphorylation. This is also a way to form ATP. Substrate-level phosphorylation is the formation of ATP by which an enzyme transfers a phosphate from an intermediate substrate to ADP. So ini dia adalah ambil phosphate group daripada benda lain dan lekatkan kepada ADP. The energy from the breakdown of the substrate is used to form ATP. ATP will be generated in glycolysis and Krebs cycle. The amount of ATP produced is small compared to oxidative phosphorylation in the ETC. So ini adalah salah satu cara untuk hasilkan ATP. Biasanya kita akan nampak substrate level phosphorylation ini pada peringkat glycolysis dan Krebs cycle. Tapi bilangan ATP yang dihasilkan melalui cara ini jauh lebih sedikit berbanding dengan ATP yang dihasilkan melalui oxidative phosphorylation ataupun ETC. And this is a diagram showing what we mean by substrate level phosphorylation. So you start with a phosphate group on another substrate. Enzyme helps to take that phosphate, stick it to an ATP, and that will produce the product and a new ATP molecule. Okay, and then this is a very quick overview or outline of the processes involved in aerobic respiration. So kalau kamu mau belajar pasal aerobic respiration, kita akan gunakan diagram ini untuk video-video selepas ini. So you'll see more of this later, don't worry. So that is the end for this video. Just a very quick recap, a summary of what we've gone through in this video. We talk about how there is a need for energy in living organisms and the role of respiration to generate that energy for the living organisms. And we also had an outline for the complete oxidation of glucose. Dalam uti kata lain, kita cakap pasal outline untuk aerobic respiration. Ito termasuklah glycolysis, Krebs cycle, dan oxidative phosphorylation. And not to forget, we also went through a few terms which might be helpful for your future understanding. Okay, so that is it for this video. What should you do now? You should grab a piece of plain A4 paper and draw this diagram. Make sure that you put in all the key information from this diagram into your drawing. If you need more papers, feel free, because you might need to do more drawing in the next coming subtopics. That's all for this part of the lesson, and I will see you again in the next video as we dive into each process. Bye!